A stunning and very upsetting admission today from the federal government. Thousands of Marines and their families drank toxic water over 3 decades at Camp LeJeune in North Carolina. And the tainted water may now be linked to hundreds of cases of cancer and other illnesses. David Martin now with one family's heartbreaking story.
Janie went through hell. And all of us who loved her, we went through hell with her.
Looking like the Marine Corps drill sergeant he once was, Jerry Ensminger poured out to a House committee his overwhelming grief and anger over the death of his young daughter from leukemia more than a decade ago.
Every time they stuck a needle through her bone in her hip to pull out bone marrow, I held her, and she screamed in my ear, "Daddy, Daddy, don't let them hurt me."
When Janie was conceived, Ensminger and his family were living at Camp LeJeune, North Carolina. Drinking tap water, a new federal health study says, was contaminated with toxins up to 40 times current safety standards. Chemicals from a local dry cleaner seeped into Lejeune's water for 3 decades. During that time, 75,000 people lived there, and some 20,000 children were born. The contaminants found in the water at Lejeune have been linked in scientific literature to birth defects and childhood cancers.
When we have military men and women serving our country and they have their families with them, they expect certainly safe water to drink. I think what's happened at Camp LeJeune is a real blight on all of us.
The Marines discovered the contamination in 1982, but allowed the families to keep drinking the water for another 5 years before they shut down all the wells. It took until the year 2000 to notify families who drank the water, a delay Ensminger cannot forgive.
What they have filled me with is a terrible resolve to expose their misconduct, their arrogance, and their incompetence.
850 former residents of Lejeune have filed claims totaling $4 billion for personal injury or death. But it will be another year before scientific studies determine whether the water can be blamed for what happened to Janie. David Martin, CBS News, The Pentagon.
There was an infuriating story last night on the CBS Evening News. The tap water at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which trains more than 12,000 Marines every year, was toxic for decades. Now, 850 residents are suing the U.S. government because many of them have gotten sick and even died. Chemicals from a local dry cleaner seeped into Lejeune's water system for 3 decades, a period when 75,000 people lived there and 20,000 children were born. Even more shocking, the Marines discovered the water was contaminated 25 years ago, but allowed families to keep drinking it for 5 more years before shutting down the wells. Families weren't even told the drinking water was toxic until 2000. This is a travesty. People who are willing to give their lives for their country deserve better. At the very least, they should be guaranteed a certain quality of life that includes safe drinking water. That's a page from my notebook. I'm Katie Couric, CBS News.
Her mother's family history, my family history, I found no other child that had ever been diagnosed with leukemia. This was just out of the blue. That nagging question stayed with me throughout her illness, through her death, and all those years after.
Good evening. Camp LeJeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, is the place where thousands of young Marines have trained for the day when they will serve and perhaps sacrifice for their country. But what they didn't know was that many of them may also have been sacrificing their health by drinking and bathing in what turned out to be highly contaminated water at Camp LeJeune. Scientists and federal investigators now believe Camp LeJeune may be the worst example of water contamination this country has ever seen. It's estimated that between 500,000 to 1 million Marines and their families were exposed to high levels of chemicals over a nearly 30-year period. And what's most shocking is that Camp LeJeune officials allegedly knew their water was contaminated, yet it took them years to track the source of the contamination and close down the wells. Getting to the bottom of what happened has become this man's mission. Jerry Ensminger spent 24 years in the Marine Corps as a drill sergeant. He trained over 2,000 new recruits.
I instilled in those kids our motto, which is Semper Fidelis, which is Latin for always faithful. And I also instilled in them our slogan, that we take care of our own. Finally, on
But Ensminger believes the Marine Corps was not taking care of its own. It all began when he and his pregnant wife were living at Camp LeJeune in the 1970s. After their daughter Janie was born, they lived a typical military life. Until one day when Janie was 6 years old. That's when doctors diagnosed the drill sergeant's daughter with cancer, leukemia, and she was about to face years of painful treatment. For 2 years, Janie suffered round after round of chemotherapy, but ultimately lost her battle in 1985. She was 9 years old. While his daughter was dying, the Marine sergeant, who was used to a world of order, tried to do everything he could to overcome his feeling of helplessness.
And I researched her mother's family history, my family history. I found no other child that had ever been diagnosed with leukemia. This was just out of the blue. That nagging question stayed with me throughout her illness, through her death, and all those years after. I was coming out of the kitchen with a plate of food to watch the evening news. And the lead story on the news, the reporter said that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry had released their public health assessment for Camp LeJeune, and the chemicals that they had found in the drinking water were linked to childhood, or possibly linked to childhood cancer. Primarily leukemia is 5 parts per billion.
The contamination came from discarded dry cleaning chemicals that leaked through the sandy soil into the aquifer that supplies the base. The dry cleaner is just a stone's throw from base property. The business has since changed names and is under new management. This map from the base shows the proximity of the contaminated well to the housing area at Tarama Terrace, where Sergeant Ensminger and his family lived. But while this contamination was coming from off base, there was other toxic dumping taking place on the base itself. A back area of the post known as Lot 203 had been the dumping ground since the base opened in the 1940s. Everything from cleaning solvents to drums of now banned pesticide DDT were discarded here. Former Marine Joe Paliotti worked for 16 years dumping toxins on the lots, as he acknowledged to a local TV station.
It'll come down there, we used to dump it. DDT, cleaning fluid, batteries, transformers, vehicles, anything the surplus the government had. I knew sooner or later something was going to happen. Even after I retired, I said somebody's going to pay for it.
This interview was taped in 2004, a week before Paliotti died of cancer. Cancer he thought was caused by working around the toxins. Perhaps most remarkable was that when the military decided to build another well at the base in the 1970s, the site they chose was an area adjacent to Lot 203, the dumping ground. The well supplied water to a base housing complex called Hadnot Point. Years later, water testing confirmed a slew of chemicals, but primarily a chemical called TCE, a solvent used for cleaning metal parts and a known carcinogen in high concentrations.
It's 1,400 parts per billion. Multiple documented readings.
That's almost 300 times the recommended limit. TCE in drinking water has been linked to brain and spinal defects, cleft lip and palate, and childhood leukemia. The area around the dumping ground is fenced off with a hazardous waste sign now. But look how close the well was to that site. The grassy area highlighted is where the well was drilled, just yards from the contamination site. Ensminger obtained copies of this 1980 internal lab report that warned the water was highly contaminated. Yet no action was taken to close the wells. 2 years later, the lab was asked to test for other chemicals, but it came across TCE and PCE in levels that, according to this internal document, quote, appeared to be at high levels and hence more important from a health standpoint than the other chemicals they were being asked to test for. For good measure, the lab added, "For these reasons, we call the situation to the attention of Camp LeJeune personnel." Despite being warned that Camp LeJeune's water was contaminated, the base did not close its contaminated wells until 5 years later. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Michael Tenkate is a lawyer for the Defense Department. He provides legal advice on environmental matters to the Marine Corps. We asked him why the wells weren't closed for 5 years after toxins were found in the water. Remember, those wells were the only source of drinking water on the base.
If I could draw a distinction, the chemicals were first discovered in the early 1980s. It was not until late 1984 and early 1985 that it was discovered that it was actually in the wells.
I want to make sure I understand here. As soon as it was known that the TCEs and PCEs were in the wells, at whatever level it was shut down?
Yes, sir. The base was trying to determine the source, and as soon as they discovered, hey, the source of the chemicals was the well, that well was shut down.
But they went to try to find out the source because it was determined the chemicals were in the water. As soon as the chemicals were found in the water, why wasn't the well shut down, and then you could find out where it came from?
I think I'm drawing the distinction you're asking about. Again, we worked very closely with the regulators in North Carolina. We continued to try and trace those chemicals. Once the source had been found, we shut down the wells. And compliance is a #1 priority for us. We're talking about the health and welfare of our Marines and their families.
But Ensminger uncovered this 1985 letter to the residents of Tarawa Terrace, which seems to downplay the situation significantly. The commanding general describes the contamination levels, up to 43 times higher than the EPA recommendation, as minute or trace amounts. Question how the commanding general could call levels as high as 43 times higher than the EPA's level could be described as minute trace amounts.
Sir, I can't respond to that. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, and I'm not a health expert. I don't really have the expertise to comment about what is a low level, what is a high level, what is safe, what is not safe.
We did contact health experts who have studied the effects of these chemicals. The Massachusetts Department of Health, among others, has found an increased risk of childhood leukemia in a group exposed to TCE in utero. Massachusetts is a particularly relevant state. It was in the town of Woburn that high levels of TCE found in the drinking water were associated with high cancer rates. That story was made famous by the best-selling book, A Civil Action, which was made then into a Hollywood movie. What does this have to do with the Marines at Camp LeJeune? Well, when the movie was released in 1998, the director of Camp LeJeune's toxic cleanup program wrote in an internal email that he wanted to delay health questionnaires being sent to former residents of the base who might have also been affected by TCE and PCE. He wrote, "Just a thought, with the movie coming out in December, can we delay the questionnaires until April-May timeframe?" And a follow-up email then states, "P.S. It appears we have to put off the questionnaires being mailed until at least February 99. Anybody who knows the Marines knows that part of their code is leave no Marine behind. In this case, have Marines been left behind?
Sir, we don't want that to happen. That's why we want to find every former resident and make sure that they have the most current information about this issue.
The Marine Corps today says it's actively reaching out to former base residents.
We're reaching out with internal publications, Marine Corps specific publications, veteran specific publications, as we cast the net wider, local newspaper, local radio spots, national newspaper.
Tenkate says the Marine Corps has been vindicated by several studies.
There have been 5 major investigations into this, one of which was conducted by the Marine Corps itself, directed by the Commandant, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office in North Carolina, the EPA's CID, Criminal Investigative Division, and the Government Oversight, GAO. They also investigated us as well into those very allegations, and they were found to be unfounded.
But some scientists and investigators we talked to say they think these reports were biased, flawed, and inaccurate. And now the Defense Department is having... Finally, these 2 notes. More than $4 billion in claims have been filed against the Defense Department by former residents of the base. The outcome of the claims is awaiting a report from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. That agency has contacted more than 12,000 children of mothers who were pregnant while on base during the years of water contamination. They found a number of illnesses, including childhood leukemia, at almost double the rate found among children in the general population. But the agency has yet to determine if the increased rates are due to toxins in the water. The agency says that the report has been delayed due to the complexity of the contamination, as well as the difficulty they've had getting accurate information from the Defense Department. The EPA has spent the last 19 years cleaning contaminated soil and water at 46 sites within Camp LeJeune and does not expect to finish until some point between 2020 and 2050. As for the more than 56,000 Marines and family members currently living at Camp LeJeune, their water is now being tested regularly and meets EPA standards.
I'm Rick Sanchez. Abby Boudreau is going to be staying with us here. You can't help but feel for those Marines with breast cancer. Imagine how difficult that must be for them just to tell their story. The case seems pretty convincing that it was, in fact, contaminated drinking water at Camp LeJeune that may have caused this condition for them. Major General Carl Jensen is the commanding general of the Marine Corps Installations East. He's good enough to join us now from Washington. Major, thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me ask you what, as you probably heard me just allude to, most Americans watching us right now are probably thinking. These men allege that they're not being taken care of by the Corps. What is your response to them?
Well, first off, our hearts, our thoughts, our prayers are with all those who are suffering. The Marine Corps has invested approximately $15 million to study this issue. We have funded studies, most recently with the National Research Council from the Academy of Sciences to try and determine a causal relationship. I know you're intimate with this story, so you know how important that is to establish a service-related disability for these men and women who are suffering.
What about, and I don't, sir, I certainly don't mean to interrupt, but cutting to the chase here, I heard those men say to you, and I think that's what I heard, right, Abby, that you, the Marine Corps, knew at least 5 years into that water having a problem there at the base, and nothing was done about it. Nothing was said. Do you not agree that that in and of itself makes you liable?
Here's what happened. That water was tested, retested. We were in full compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency regulations. There were 3 studies that were done examining all of the actions associated over that 5-year period from 80 to 85. One was conducted by the EPA, another one by GAO, and a third was a Commandant of the Marine Corps directed fact-finding session that involved outside independent agencies. All 3 of those determined that the Marine Corps acted appropriate.
So, General, are you saying that the Marine Corps does not have any responsibility here?
The Marine Corps, I believe, fulfilled its requirements under the EPA, using EPA guidelines.
This summer, thousands of former Marines all across the country learned something alarming. The base where they had been stationed, Camp LeJeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, was the site of one of the worst water contaminations in U.S. history. In late June, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry launched a massive study, one of the largest of its kind, tracking down 300,000 residents who had lived at Camp LeJeune during some part of a 30-year period. They may have been exposed to dangerous substances in the base's water supply. The agency hopes to determine whether it can find a pattern that connects serious health issues to exposure to the chemicals. A new documentary called Semper Fi follows one man's journey from devoted Marine to activist, searching for answers about what happened at Camp LeJeune, who knew, and when. The exposure period began in the mid-1950s and lasted until 1987, according to the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. In 1982, tests found that a number of water sources on the base contained one or more of the following contaminants. There was trichloroethylene, or TCE, a chemical commonly found in degreasers for metal parts. Tetrachloroethylene, or PCE, which is used in dry cleaning products. Later tests also detected benzene, a known carcinogen found in gasoline. According to the ATSDR, up to 1.1 million gallons of gasoline leaked into the drinking water at Camp LeJeune. Back in 1982, the levels of PCE found were 20 times above the current EPA standard, and the levels of TCE were 280 times above the EPA standard. 71 men who developed breast cancer and had lived at Camp LeJeune blame contaminated water for their conditions, according to a Camp LeJeune advocacy group. Breast cancer in men is rare, comprising less than 1% of all cases in the United States.
We were exposed to high levels of tetrachloroethylene, trichloroethylene.
The contamination has been the subject of 3 congressional hearings over the past 7 years. At issue, why wait to shut down the contaminated wells and wait to notify the public? While the Marine Corps was made aware of the presence of contaminants back in 1982, it did not shut the first of the contaminated wells until 1984. The U.S. Marine Corps issued a statement to Need to Know. There were no drinking water regulations or notification requirements for these chemicals at the time, and there would not be until years later. Base residents were alerted of the contamination through notification by a press conference by the base commanding general, an article in the base newspaper, and a press event that resulted in several articles in local newspapers. One veteran, a retired Marine drill instructor, has made it his mission to get answers from the U.S. Marine Corps. In 1985, Jerry Ensminger's 9-year-old daughter, Janie, died of a rare leukemia. Ensminger believes her death was caused by the contaminated water at Camp LeJeune. Jerry's story caught the attention of documentary filmmaker Rachel Liebert. In the film Semper Fi, Always Faithful, Jerry Ensminger and other Marine veterans uncover documents about the extent of the contamination that he says the military has been hiding.
We stayed at Camp LeJeune until December of 1975, and that was when Janie was conceived. In July of 1983, Janie got leukemia. After the shock of her diagnosis wore off, my reaction was to question it. Why? And that nagging question of why stayed with me through her illness, through her death, and for 14 and a half years. It's something that doesn't just go away. It never does. In '97, I found out about the water contamination. I was fixing a plate of food in the kitchen, getting ready for the evening news. The reporter said,
"The contaminants found in the water at LeJeune have been linked in scientific literature to birth defects and childhood cancers."
My first thought was this what happened to Janie?
They signed up to serve, wearing the uniform wherever the Corps needs them to go, and that means their family members as well. But at the center of this story is a very troubling controversy. Upwards of 1 million Marines and their family members were exposed to contaminated drinking water over 35 years. And tonight, Dr. Nancy Snyderman investigates the cases of Marines who have developed a rare and frightening disease, male breast cancer, and say the government hasn't done enough to help them.
Oh, well, the first thing that went through my mind was, what contest in hell did I win to deserve this? I don't drink.
Mike Partain got the shock of his life 5 years ago when he was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 39.
And this is what it looks like to have male breast cancer.
That he got breast cancer at all is surprising.
And you can see the calcifications in it.
It's so rare. For every 100 women who get it, just one man will. But it's how Mike says he got breast cancer that is the biggest shock of all.
Maybe you're just unlucky.
I thought that at first, but that all changed 3 months after I was diagnosed. You see, I went from being an average, just an ordinary person to being a breast cancer patient to finding out that the place where I was born was contaminated.
The son of a Marine, he was born at Camp LeJeune in North Carolina, one of the largest and most storied Marine bases in the country.
The entire time my mother was pregnant with me, we were drinking high levels of tetrachloroethylene, trichloroethylene, and benzene in our water.
He says contaminated tap water at Camp LeJeune caused his breast cancer, and he's not alone.
How many of you, by a show of hands, believe that the United States Marines are in some way in part responsible for your getting breast cancer?
These men are among a group of 83 Mike Partain has found who lived or served at Camp LeJeune and have been diagnosed with breast cancer.
Hard to believe that he had male breast cancer.
Embarrassing?
Well, it was kind of embarrassing at first to tell others.
It was more frustration because no one knew what to do with us, or me. Can't speak for the rest of the guys, but the doctors and surgeons did not know really how to treat me. And that was kind of unnerving and scary.
The story of how these men found each other began after Mike Partain saw a news report in 2007. A former Marine named Jerry Ensminger was telling Congress how his 9-year-old daughter, Janie, died of leukemia.
Every time they stuck a needle through her bone in her hip to pull out bone marrow, I held her.
And that he believed her death was caused by the drinking water at Camp LeJeune.
I can assure you that there are many more individuals and families who are now literally spread out all over this country, if not this world, that are wondering what happened to me.
I immediately thought, my knees buckled, I grabbed the back of the couch, and I sat there and was like, oh my God, this is what happened.
Mike learned there was a long history of suspicion about the water at Camp LeJeune.
Is it your premise that the United States Marine Corps knew there was contaminated water and chose not to let people know about it?
Their own documents show clearly that they were warned beginning in 1980 by their own laboratories and the scientists that they hired that the water was contaminated.
Those documents he's referring to were produced when the Marines started routinely testing tap water in 1980 and eventually found high levels of cancer-causing chemicals. In one case, over 280 times the acceptable standard.
They chose to keep those wells on for whatever reason and did not begin shutting the wells down until 1984.
Officials say that's because it took them 4 years to find out exactly which wells were poisoned, and that once they were located, they were shut down immediately. Some of those chemicals were linked to a dry cleaner off base that had been contaminating the water since 1953. It has since closed. But the worst contamination was caused directly by the Marine Corps because of its industrial waste practices and leaking fuel storage tanks. This document, released just last December by the CDC, details how over 1 million gallons of fuel seeped into the ground, contaminating well water.
At the time that I found my tumor, they knew I had been exposed and no one had told me. That's what angers me about this.
Marine Corps officials declined several requests for an on-camera interview. In an email to NBC News, The Corps acknowledges the water was contaminated, but says that reliable scientific evidence is lacking to prove one way or another whether it caused illness. However, one of the nation's most respected experts on cancer and the environment sees it differently. How would you characterize the level of contamination at Camp LeJeune?
Well, the level in the drinking water was the highest that I've ever seen.
University of Massachusetts epidemiologist Dr. Richard Clapp has examined the data from Camp LeJeune.
Cancer develops over a period of years, sometimes decades, but that's occurred. That amount of time has lapsed.
He was also involved in another high-profile environmental case, one linking contaminated drinking water and childhood leukemia in Woburn, Massachusetts. It was the basis for the book and later the hit movie, A Civil Action.
Good morning, Mr. Riley. Would you care for a glass of water?
I've been working on this kind of thing for 30 years. I've never heard of a community that's had the levels of contaminants that they had at Camp LeJeune. And then the cluster of disease, for example, male breast cancer, may also turn out to be the highest that's been seen anywhere.
Other kinds of cancers that may be related to the poisoned water at Camp LeJeune include cancers of the kidney, lung, and bladder, as well as childhood leukemia. Even though the Marine Corps says there's not enough proof these diseases were caused by the water, Congress did not agree. And in 2012, the president signed a law creating a fund to provide health benefits to Camp LeJeune veterans who can show the contamination made them sick. But these men haven't seen a dime.
How many of you have submitted claims to the Veterans Administration for money? How many have been given anything?
Fat chance there.
Tom Gervasi says the clock is ticking.
I've got stage 4 terminal cancer. My survival is minimal. What I worry about is my wife and her being taken care of by the VA and the Marine Corps, if at all possible.
I've just recently lost my wife, but if there's anything that could be done to help my kids, that'd be helpful.
And did you hear anything?
No, I've been denied 6 times.
They are waiting on a report from the CDC, which they believe will help them prove it was the water that made them sick, and that the Marine Corps is in fact responsible. Dr. Chris Portier is working on this report for the CDC.
Can you tell me at this point how many people you believe have come into contact with contaminated water?
Our estimates are somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million people.
500,000 to 1 million?
Correct.
The Camp LeJeune families say the CDC analysis, begun more than 20 years ago, is taking way too long. They accuse the agency and the military of stonewalling.
I understand the need to get data right. But while you're waiting for the final report to come out in spring, there are men still being denied benefits. What's the delay?
We've always felt that the Marines at Camp LeJeune deserve the best that we can do. And
But they're not getting that.
Yes, they are. From us, they're getting the best we can do. We've done every study we can. I have pushed my staff to get it done as fast as possible because I think we are late on this one. But we will deliver a product that will answer some questions.
In its email to NBC News, the Marine Corps said, "We recognize that some of our Marines, sailors, and their families have experienced health issues they believe are associated with water they drank or used in the past at Camp LeJeune. Our hearts go out to those individuals, no matter what the cause." Officials say they have tried to notify all the people who were potentially exposed to the contaminated water. But breast cancer patient Terry Torney says the Marines never warned him that he might be at risk.
I pay my taxes every year. They follow me. You know, they know where I'm at.
Right.
You know, if they want to find out something, they want to find out who an individual is, they have the capability.
All a matter of priority. They have the capability to find out everybody and anything that lived there or walked there. However, it's, do they want to?
If you're going to hang your hat as an institution on honor and integrity,
Right.
when something like this happens, you've got to step up to the plate. They had their orders to protect us. When is the leadership of the Marine Corps going to stand up and say, We made a mistake.
Nobody joins the Marine Corps to get rich.
No,
they
in
join
fact,
to serve their country.
And you do, and if you go join the Marine Corps, you expect at some point to go into battle and maybe take a bullet. You don't expect the drinking water to cause you an illness decades later.
Are we at least assured that today, on the grounds at Camp LeJeune, that the water flows cleanly from the tap?
I can tell you that the Marine Corps says they are testing the water, but I can also tell you that this is an active Superfund site. So how you reconcile those two, as of this evening, I cannot tell you.
Well, the gentleman who said we owe them our very best is absolutely right, and we'll
we owe
stay
them
on
more
this.
answers, frankly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy
bet, Brian.
Snyderman, for doing that story.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to give the committee my perspective on the effects of toxic exposure on our nation's veterans and the Department of Veterans Affairs' often inadequate and frustrating response. Mr. Chairman, this has been a long road, and I ask for the committee's indulgence because I'm not sure that I can give you a very long history in 5 minutes. It may take 6. Before I begin, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize Master Sergeant Jerry Insminger, United States Marine Corps retired from White Lake, North Carolina, who's here today and who has been a relentless advocate for Camp LeJeune, for its veterans, for over 15 years. Let me just say, Jerry, we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your fidelity, your courage, and your commitment. Mr. Chairman, during my time on the committee, one toxic exposure issue continued to garner our attention because of its scope, its severity, and the intense public interest, and that's the contamination of the water supply at Camp LeJeune, North Carolina. From 1953 to 1987, we know Camp LeJeune residents were exposed to poisoned water from industrial dumping on the base and contamination from a dry cleaner off base. This 34-year event has been called the worst incident of environmental exposure in our nation's history. Hundreds of thousands of service members, their families, civilian workers drank and bathed in water that had been exposed to mixed cancer-causing chemicals that in one case took the life of a 9-year-old girl, Janie Insminger, who was born on base. Once metabolized, the chemical in the water could cause birth defects and increased risk of multiple cancers. The government's scientific investigation into Camp LeJeune began in 1989, but we've only seen significant progress in the last 5 years, spurred by the uncovering of critical Navy and Marine Corps records and the completion of a long overdue studies on the effects of the contamination. Along the way, I went to great lengths to reveal the truth about Camp LeJeune and hold the military and the VA accountable. To this day, I remain appalled at how the United States government has treated these service members and their families. Our government rewarded the sacrifices of these patriotic men and women by negligently poisoning them and their families and by engaging in a decades-long cover-up. It wasn't until 2011, after significant congressional pressure, that the VA began consolidating all disability claims at one VA regional office and coding and tracking them. During the time, I introduced the Janie Insminger Act, named in honor of Master Sergeant Insminger's late daughter. The law was passed and signed into law in 2012. It has provided the much needed and overdue medical relief to veterans and eligible family members seeking health care for cancers and conditions associated with toxic exposure at Camp LeJeune. Janie's law was based on scientific findings required by congressionally mandated review because within the VA there wasn't the expertise or the resources to explore the science of toxic exposure. The government studies on Camp LeJeune conducted by the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR, are based on test results from water samples taken at Camp LeJeune over successive years. The studies show some of the highest levels of recorded toxins in any U.S. water system, and it reached the taps in houses, in barracks, and offices. ATSDR has found that Camp LeJeune residents experienced higher rates of mortality at a younger age than those from an unaffected Marine Corps base. higher incidence of birth defects in children born on the base, and a statistically high number of male breast cancer survivors. In fact, several chemicals found in Camp LeJeune water are now classified as known human carcinogens by the EPA and the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Mr. Chairman, the resistance inside the VA to the scientific data and the fact that Camp LeJeune demonstrates how VA has dealt with the scientific facts of toxic exposure overall. In the case of LeJeune, their approach ranged from scare tactics, like issuing overinflated estimates on long-term cost of care to this committee and benefits, and suggesting the Department of Defense should take care of Camp LeJeune families instead of VA. They produced passive-aggressive rebuttals of the scientific findings, have sought additional scientific studies, and created a bizarre procedural hurdle for Camp LeJeune veterans to overcome in the disability claims process. To this day, LeJeune veterans from across the country contact my office and relate demoralizing accounts of ignorant VA doctors in a claims process that is frequently deaf and blind to scientific evidence and medical opinion. This summer, Secretary McDonnell indicated he wants his people to back away from this adversarial approach, work with veterans with a history of toxic exposure, and begin by engaging Congress and government scientists to develop sound policies for Camp LeJeune veterans. In July, Senator Tillis and I sat down with the chairman and Secretary McDonnell to raise some questions that were very serious about a VA team of clinicians reviewing LeJeune veterans' disability claims before final decisions were made on service connection. These VA doctors were in various cases cherry-picking the science, misrepresenting or misinterpreting scientific studies, using questionable sources, and overruling the opinions of veteran oncologists. In the glaring case of one Marine, Norman McElney, suffering from kidney cancer, a VA clinician stated that there was no evidence one of the chemicals at Camp LeJeune water, the carcinogen TCE, was known to cause kidney cancer. VBA later denied the claim. When VA was later shown evidence that the exposure to TCE is widely accepted as a cause of kidney cancer, VA removed the citation in the denial notice, then reissued it, and denied the claim again. Mr. Chairman, this is unbelievable, but sadly true. There are many other Camp LeJeune veterans with similar stories. Mr. Chairman, at our July meeting, Secretary McDonnell, to his credit, openly and fully recognized the fact that the science on Camp LeJeune was undeniable, and he agreed to work with ATSDR to compile data for a presumptive disability policy soon afterwards. And soon afterwards, VA publicly announced support for 3 cancers that would be covered. Last week, ATSDR submitted its 70-page report to VA detailing at least 6 cancers where sufficient evidence of causation from toxic exposure at LeJeune exists, and several more conditions where moderate evidence of causation exists. Secretary McDonnell has taken the first step to acknowledge ATSDR and other key agencies must play an integral role in helping VA confirm and understand toxic exposure. But I'm not convinced the olive branch from the Secretary will result in good policy beyond LeJeune if VA ultimately decides polishing its image more than the scientific merit. When it comes to confirmed toxic exposure like those at Camp LeJeune, make certain the VA heeds the best science. Will be required strong and engaged leadership from Secretary McDonnell and, Mr. Chairman, rigorous oversight from this committee. Congress must ensure VA health and benefits policy is based on fact, not conjecture or emotion, so those veterans who have been harmed by toxic exposures are properly cared for and compensation for their suffering. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this opportunity. I thank for the indulgence of the committee, and I trust the committee will continue its very important responsibility.
Well, thank you.
LeJeune veterans sickened by tainted water will be granted disability benefits. As Mike Holfeld tells us, the change in policy is years overdue.
That will start the process of amending its regulations to establishing presumptions of service connection.
For Camp LeJeune veteran advocate Mike Partain, today is a moment years in the making.
For 8 years, we've been marching around the walls of Jericho, and last night, suddenly, the walls came down.
Partain says it's the first win for Camp LeJeune veterans since 2012.
I stood in the Oval Office and watched President Obama sign into law the Jenny Insmer Act, which gave health care for the veterans and the families at Camp LeJeune.
But it wasn't an absolute fix. Thousands of veterans were still denied disability benefits. Donald Burpee is a prime example. We introduced you to him months ago, a veteran with kidney cancer who died before he could be awarded his benefits.
There was no reason why he should have died not knowing whether his family was going to be taken care of. We failed as a country, our veteran.
But now it appears that's all going to change. Kidney cancer is one of the diseases the VA is considering for presumptive service connection. Angiosarcoma of the liver and acute myelogenous leukemia are the others.
So what exactly is presumptive service connection? What in the world does that mean?
Once the presumptive service category is created, all you have to do is show that you have the disease that's listed and that you were at Camp LeJeune during the time period of contamination.
No questions asked?
No questions asked.
Victory?
That's a victory. And once that's formalized, that's a victory.
Burpee didn't live to see this announcement, but his widow, Brenda, is hopeful he didn't die in vain. In a statement to Local 6, she said in part, "Now we will see how swiftly the VA can act to make this a reality. In the meantime, there's still work to be done."
There are other diseases. For example, male breast cancer, bladder cancer are associated with solvent exposure, and there is medical evidence there to support that. The VA is going to have to look at that with ATSDR and rate that as one of the service connections.
The VA says those discussions will take place at an August 19th meeting, so there is hope.
Channel 6 provided a voice for the veterans in the community that would not otherwise be heard, and for that we're extremely grateful.
Brenda Burpee says she's hopeful this announcement will mean she will be awarded the benefits she believes are owed to her husband Don, but so far has not heard from the VA as to whether that will happen.
Tonight, it's a major victory for veterans. The VA has announced it would consider automatically giving benefits to some vets suffering from certain conditions connected to toxic drinking water at Camp LeJeune.
It's called presumptive service connection, and it means vets would not have to fight to get compensation. But as investigator Mike Holfeld tells us, even if that designation is granted to some, thousands of vets with other conditions would not be covered.
The day Jim Renna found out he had breast cancer started out just like any other, except for one thing.
I was taking a shower one time at home in Connecticut, and I felt a lump under my left arm. I said, what the heck is that? Went to the doctors and found out I had breast cancer. Highly unusual for men.
So unusual, in fact, it accounts for less than 1% of all breast cancers.
You have 100 cases, everyone at Camp LeJeune.
Right.
You're one of them.
It was really a shock to me. because I didn't think that this was possible.
Flashback, nearly 60 years.
My cousin was a Marine. I always liked the Marines.
Jim served at Camp LeJeune for a month and a half in 1956.
It's 80, 90 degrees hot. You're always looking for water to drink.
Water that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry says was tainted with a high level of chemicals and increased the risk of cancer for up to 1 million Marines and their families who drank it.
It's our position that the contaminants site likely increase the risk of a number of cancers, including kidney cancer, multiple myeloma, leukemias, and others.
The agency also just finished a study on male breast cancer, which supports a link between the disease and the water.
We think the study suggests that there's increased male breast cancer risk, and it's something that we'll be following up in future studies.
Jim says he believes it because for him, the story didn't stop at breast cancer.
Then I went to lymphoma, which I just got treated my last shot yesterday, and then I have bladder cancer now.
But still, Jim has been denied.
I get nothing. I get headaches and heartaches and, marks in my arms.
Despite the fact that his own doctor says the water is the reason for his cancer.
In fact, he wrote a letter to the VA stating that all 3 cancers he felt are so coincidental that they come from the problem in Lejeune.
So he and his wife Nancy have been fighting.
We have been doing this for at least 5 years.
Infuriating for you?
I feel there should be some accountability. Unbeknownst to him, he was drinking this contaminated water and it was damaging his body. And now, hey, I got hurt. Well, oh, gee, too bad, from the VA.
And even if some vets are granted presumptive service connection, it doesn't mean breast cancer will be included.
People serve our country and love our country, and then this is what you get? They're going to turn your back on them?
They just keep putting it on the back shelf.
To be clear, we've asked the VA several times for a timeline for presumptive service connection and if they plan to consider other conditions like breast cancer. So far, a representative told us she doesn't have those answers. Mike Holfeld, News 6.
Now, some vets are also asking if they will be automatically approved if presumptive service connection is granted. So far, the VA has not answered that question. Now, we have posted more of the phone interview with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry on our Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com.